Hi, everybody. You've probably been through this already since I see a lot of familiar faces and participant lists, but would you please fill out the polls that you see before you? Just check the box that applies to you. We're trying to keep track of the attendance at all of these sessions. As people come in, as they enter the webinar, please fill out the polls. And also, if you will, in the chat box, indicate what your affiliation is. We'll be starting in a couple of minutes here. Mike, do you want to continue with the polls for a few more minutes here, or shall we go on to the webinar?
I'd say it's up to you, Richard. We're only a minute after 11, so.
We can wait for a couple more minutes until people come into the room. Yeah. Well, why don't we begin, Mike? It's a couple minutes after 11 now, and we've got a pretty full plate. Welcome, everybody, to the third session of the webinar series on ecology and active management of riparian vegetation and forested landscapes. My name is Richard Harris, and I work with Northern California Society of American Foresters, organizing educational events like this. Most of you have already seen this if you've been here for the past sessions. Basically, what we're trying to do with this webinar series is to provide a foundation of information on riparian functions and ecology, describe some of the tools for identifying sites for active riparian management, and present some case studies illustrating the benefits of active management. The webinar series was developed by the NorCal Society of American Foresters, UC Cooperative Extension, California Department of Forestry and Fire Protection, California Department of Fish and Wildlife, and the California Association of Resource Conservation Districts, their Forestry and Fire Committee. Funding for the webinar is provided by a grant from the USDA Forest Service, State and Private Forestry. The program so far has dealt with riparian functions and disturbances affecting riparian ecosystems, and last week approaches to selecting sites for active management. Today, what we're going to hear are two presentations, one on the active management of wood in streams and active management effects on temperature and microclimate. Next week, we'll talk about wildfire hazards and enhancing salmonid productivity, and we'll close with presentations on reducing sediment sources and monitoring. Ground rules, each presentation is about 30 to 45 minutes. The participants may communicate with presenters and with each other by typing into the chat box on the lower left of your screen. During the presentations, you may submit questions into the chat box, and we'll save these for response after the presentations. At the close of each presentation, you may also ask questions. We'll stop at 1 o'clock for when there's no more questions. And if we have more questions that we can address, then we'll save them for later response. Here's my contact information if you want to provide me any direct feedback. With that, I'd like to introduce our first presenter. Jennifer Carah is an ecologist with the Nature Conservancy's North Coast program in California, working primarily on salmonid habitat monitoring restoration projects. Over the last several years, she's collaborated with foresters and loggers to implement cost-efficient salmon habitat restoration projects at the 24,000-acre Garcia River forest property in Mendocino County, on which the Conservancy owns a conservation easement. With that, I'll turn it over to you, Jen.
All right, thanks, Richard, and thanks to the UC Cooperative Extension and the sponsors for having me. I also would like to thank my co-presenters, Dave Wright from Campbell Timberland Management, Chris Blanco from Blanco Watershed Management, and Lisa Bolton from Trout Unlimited. One second. There we go. So here are a list of the topics I wanted to cover today. First, just talk briefly about why wood. Mike already talked a fair amount about this in the last few sessions, so I won't spend too much time here. I'll focus more on what approach we're using and talk about what we've been able to achieve so far, and then some lessons learned on what we think we need for a successful project. Get into the design criteria a bit, as well as the funding and permitting considerations, and then talk a little bit about what the limitations of this particular technique are. I'll say right here from the beginning that we don't think that this particular way of doing wood augmentation is appropriate in all situations. It's definitely not. And at the very end there, I'll talk a little bit about some other ways that folks might consider adding wood in other situations. So just briefly, salmon need a lot of things to be healthy, have healthy populations and healthy runs. And I've listed a good number of those things here and starred the ones that are strongly affected or controlled by wood in the channel. And you can see that it's the majority of their habitat needs. And it does that because in-channel wood plays a really important role in determining aquatic habitat conditions and riparian ecology. And it does that by affecting flow hydraulics, regulating the sediment transport and storage, and influencing channel morphology, as well as promoting diversities of channel habitat types. But in many places across the Pacific Northwest, salmon are missing this key habitat element. And I just wanted to give a really brief history of wood management. And I put this together for the north coast of California, but I think a lot of this stuff really applies more broadly across the West. So before Europeans arrived in the West, there was a lot of wood in the creek, is the bottom line for phase one. We had, over 1 million years of wood loading, really large pieces of wood, really high densities of wood. Phase two, things started to change when Europeans started logging in the mid to late 1800s in a lot of these watersheds. In-stream wood was removed either to harvest and mill up, particularly in the case of redwood, which doesn't rot, but a lot of in-stream wood was removed because streams were used as conveyance mechanisms to move wood downstream for log ponds and, to enable splash dams and all that sort of thing. So wood was removed, and then a lot of the riparian forests were cleared at the same time. Phase 3 here, we're talking about 1940s through 1970s, the post-World War II logging boom. We move into a situation where we had excessive wood loading, so deleterious quantities of wood waste were often pushed into the streams from landings. The streams themselves may have been used as roads and had, large amounts of wood and sediment pushed in to build Humboldt crossings or road networks. And in a lot of cases, that kind of activity had a really negative effect on the stream bed and the stream banks. It could have limited spawner passage, and often did, and often compromised rearing habitat as well. And then we move into phase 4 here in the 70s and 80s. Folks who were concerned with phase 3 and the results of that kind of excessive wood loading responded to that threat and to the threat of rapidly diminishing salmon populations by starting to actually clear streams. And, at this point I want to acknowledge that we often criticize the folks who did a lot of this stream clearing, but we're using 20/20 hindsight here. And, I've got a photo here on the left of the South Fork Tenma from the mid-1980s, and you can see that there were, in many areas of California, and I'm sure the Pacific Northwest, really serious fish passage issues associated with these large wood dumps in stream. So they were responding to real threats to these fish. But what we ended up with is a situation where we're at now, in the present, where we have streams with very young riparian corridors where trees have been harvested in the riparian zone within the last 50 to 60 years, and most of the wood has been removed from the streams, so very simplified streams and simplified riparian corridors for the most part. So why do we care for fish? As I mentioned before, wood is really a primary determinant of channel form in a lot of the small to moderately sized streams of the Pacific Northwest because it influences channel erosion and deposition processes. So the way that sediments are sorted and retained creates different kinds of habitat units in the stream that are important to salmon. In particular, areas that are deeper, like pools that have slow water velocities, and shallow areas with faster water velocities like riffles. These different habitat units are formed by wood and have importance to different life stages of salmon. So I'm going to try to grab my arrow here. There we go. Okay, let's see if I can move around. Oop. All right, well, I'm having trouble moving my arrow. But on the right-hand side, I've got, in this diagram here, have a backwater type feature. So these features are really important particularly for juvenile salmon in the wintertime when these streams that are really flashy are experiencing high winter flows. They need a place to get out of that high winter flow and seek refuge. In the middle there, we've got an illustration of a scour pool that was formed from large wood. That would be used both by adults who are migrating back upstream as cover from predators, as well as juvenile fish rearing over the summer. And then on the left, showing how the scour out of the pool is depositing gravels at the foot of the pool, the head of the riffle, which is a really fantastic place for salmon to build nests. So another thing that wood does that's really important for fish is that it provides cover from predators. This is important, as I mentioned, for both the juvenile and the adult phases. Wood also plays a really important role in food. It does a couple of things to help increase food availability. for juvenile salmon. It increases the capacity of the stream to trap falling leaves and other organic debris that are good bug food. And it helps maintain the different habitat types. And since different bugs live in different habitats, it helps maintain the diversity of food sources that fish need. And then, of course, there are a whole set of bugs that fish eat that live on or in the wood itself. And studies have shown that there is a really strong relationship between fish density and wood density, particularly for coho salmon. I have a graphic here from Siddell et al. In 1988, which shows a strong relationship between the availability of wood habitat and the density of juvenile coho fish. So for all of the reasons that I talked about before, restoring wood is identified as a really high priority action in federal and state coho recovery plans to improve habitat for the fish. But we also know from some of these same plans, for example, the NIMPS recovery plan for Central California coast coho salmon that just came out this year, or that 80% of the priority focus watersheds for coho that they've identified as critical for their recovery have poor wood stocking. So there's a number of ways we can address that. The first and most obvious one is to protect and restore the riparian forests and riparian forest processes. And I'm not really going to go into this. Mike talked a lot about it over the last few sessions. Things like protecting riparian buffers and selectively managing riparian forests so that we can accelerate the development of larger trees, for example. The problem with implementing only, I guess I would say that strategy is absolutely essential to restore the natural processes and will be critical to recovering these fish over the long term, but over the short term, that's probably not going to be enough. So if you look at the figure here I have on the left, this is a graphic that depicts the volume of in-stream wood on the y-axis and the years after logging on the x-axis. And you can see that there's a significant delay following logging to the point where you actually start seeing natural wood recruitment, and it's on the order of at least 50 years. And the problem is that we can't wait 50 to 100 years for wood to start being naturally recruited back into a lot of these streams, particularly in California where we have our wild adult coho salmon population seriously on the decline. We need to get in there and start doing things to improve habitat and improve their viability right away. So a second strategy to consider is what I call accelerated recruitment of large wood as a stopgap measure in the interim period. So we're, largely are protecting our riparian forests and protecting natural processes there. An additional step we may need to take in the short term is loading these creeks with wood that the stream can use to create habitat until the riparian forests begin to supply the wood themselves. So I want to emphasize that adding wood to streams is not a new idea, but to date, many of the wood projects that have been implemented have focused on engineering or building large wood jams and anchoring them in place, what I'll call hard anchoring. And this is totally appropriate in a lot of situations. And I'll talk more about that later on in the presentation, but it does have some drawbacks, and one of the drawbacks is that those techniques can be really labor intensive and expensive to implement. And because of that, they sometimes limit the ability to meet wood restoration goals at say at a watershed or a regional scale. Again, I want to qualify that by saying that they are totally appropriate in a lot of situations as well. But when we started doing these projects, we had a goal of increasing the pace and scale of our ability to do these kinds of restoration projects. And so we wanted to look at some alternate approaches that might be appropriate in the particular context we were working in. So my co-authors who got started on this work in 2007, Dave and Lisa and Chris, went down in the southern part of Mendocino County, northern part of Sonoma County to look for some inspiration, and they met with Kathleen and others at the Wallala River Watershed Council and Henry at Wallala Redwoods. And those folks had been experimenting with trucking in salvaged wood, mostly wood that they had generated through road improvement or decommissioning projects, and then placing those pieces of wood unanchored in the stream channels. They had also been wedging some of those pieces against existing trees and stumps. And they had been doing a lot of work. I've got some facts and figures here on the amount of work that they've done to date. We really liked the work that they were doing and built on those ideas. And in our particular situations, rather than truck logs in, we're sort of relying more on a combination of riparian trees or trees that are harvested just outside the riparian corridor or on adjacent hill slopes, but still, relatively close nearby, and then skidding them to the stream on existing skid trails. So I've got a map here that shows where we have been working. So this has primarily been in Mendocino County. The pink blob up there on the north side is on the Redwood Forest Foundation property, or Ruffey property in the Usal. And then we moved south through Campbell Timberland Management and Hawthorne Timber Company land and Conservation Fund managed properties in the yellow. A few smaller projects on the Wager Ranch and state parks, the eastern part of Mendocino County there, and then and some more projects down on the southern end of Mendocino County on the Garcia River Forest, which is owned by the Conservation Fund and has an easement, conservation easement from the Nature Conservancy. So I just want to give you a brief overview of what we've been able to achieve using these techniques so far. So we've treated, as of this year, over 43 miles of key coho streams. These are all streams that have been identified by NIMS as core streams for recovery of coho salmon, and we've placed almost 2,000 pieces of wood. And you can see the list of partners there is pretty long. One thing I would like you to look at on this slide is the watershed size. So these are pretty small watersheds, all things considered, that we're doing these projects in. There's a range from 2.5 square miles to up to 39 square miles for some of the larger watersheds that we've been working in. And also have a look at the average bankful widths. So we're talking about streams that have bankful widths of somewhere on the order of 16 feet to 70 feet at the upper end. And that's important to note because these techniques won't work everywhere, and we totally acknowledge that. Where they work best, we feel, is in some of these smaller watersheds, smaller streams with smaller bankful widths. So here's a little bit about what we've been doing. So this is really, we think about it kind of as a dynamic process-based approach. We're not anchoring pieces of wood. There's no rebar or cable or attaching logs to boulders or anything like that. What we're doing is essentially adding appropriately sized unanchored wood and letting natural stream processes move the wood and build jams. It's kind of like, we think of it like seeding the creek with wood pieces as an interim measure. And let's see here. So one of the first things, we use a couple of different methods to do this. One of the first ways that we do it is to use a rubber-tired skidder or rubber-tired grapple skidder, which you can see there on the left-hand side. Actually, you can see the skidder in both of these images. We also sometimes use a rubber-tired backhoe. We found the rubber tires to be really nice. They cause minimal amounts of disturbance compared to a tracked machine. And we use both of those machines to move pieces of wood and place them in the creek channel. Like I said, our logs are placed unanchored, and many are placed so that they will actually move during high winter flows. We anticipate them moving. We call those transport pieces. And the primary source of that material is standing conifers, primarily redwood, but we use fir and other stuff as well that are felled outside of the riparian zone, and then we skid them into place. We also use additional materials such as co-logs and root wodge that we salvage from upslope areas like old landings or road edges, or that are, uncovered as the land managers are doing road upgrades or decommissioning projects. We have also dug up Douglas firs where and when we had access to an excavator. So in those cases, for example, when people were doing road work nearby, we would ask to borrow the excavator for a few hours and ask them to dig up, a few trees and generate some whole tree material with the root wad attached. And that's really nice to be able to use. We use pieces of wood that are long enough, so they're about 1.5 to 2 times the width of the creek at a bank full flow at the deployment site, or at a pinch point downstream, so that we can increase the chance that when those pieces move, the wood will be long enough that it'll have a high chance of getting caught up and jamming. And I want to emphasize that the skidder or the backhoe utilizes existing skid trails, and the equipment never enters the wetted channel, so we're not required to do dewatering or fish movement with these projects. The second technique that we use is to use the skidder to wedge trees. And we're interested, so in a lot of these streams there's just not very many existing natural roughness elements left. And so since we're interested in increasing the number of those features that will naturally trap our unanchored wood or our transport pieces and help form larger jams, we also want to wedge some pieces that are sort of like the catcher's mitt to catch pieces coming downstream. These pieces are also unanchored, but they're placed strategically within existing roughness elements like wedged between stumps or trees or a boulder in a tree, or et cetera. And are by design not really intended to move very significantly. We call these retention pieces. And then the third thing that we've been doing is just opportunistically free-falling near stream trees. So in reaches with sufficient conifer stocking, we will directly fall riparian conifers into the stream where it will significantly impact stream shading. So we follow the guidelines from NIMS on this. This is required under the terms of our permits. We don't reduce riparian overstory canopy by more than 20% per lineal 100 feet within 75 feet of a watercourse. We leave native trees with defects, cavities, trees that are leaning towards the stream channel or have nests or some other sort of late cereal characteristic. We leave trees that are greater than 36 inches and large snags. And we don't operate during the migratory bird season to avoid damage or disturbance to nesting birds in the riparian forest. This method is particularly inexpensive, basically just requiring a really skilled timber faller and a chainsaw, and it can be a really practical way to accelerate recruitment of wood where there is not good heavy equipment access. Another thing that is a key part of the work we've been doing is the monitoring that we've been doing associated with this. So we do pre- and post-treatment surveys. I'll say that we weren't trying to prove that wood makes more fish or that wood makes more fish habitat. We're sort of starting from the assumption that both of those things are true and they're well supported by the literature. We were really trying to demonstrate that we could add wood at a watershed scale in a way that was cost efficient. So the monitoring techniques are not, this wasn't an experiment. It's not incredibly robust monitoring, but we did want to be tracking, in particular, our retention rates, because there was some concern that placing unanchored wood might mean losing a lot of it. So we did invest in pre- and post-treatment surveys. We did basic habitat typing using the Fish and Game Level 2 protocols. We mapped wood density and distributions before and after, and we did photo points before and after. We also tagged all of our pieces of wood with individually numbered aluminum tags. Each piece of wood had 4 tags. And we wanted to do all this to kind of catalog lessons learned for ourselves to improve our future projects and to share with others. So here are some of the results. This is a project we did in Inman Creek. This is just one of the sites that we treated there. In the upper left is looking downstream before treatment. You can see on the left we've got a big gravel bar. On the upper right is immediately after treatment, but before winter flows. So the pieces downstream are wedged, the 3 pieces downstream that you can see jutting out into the channel, and then there's about 5 pieces in the foreground. They're just sort of laid loosely on the gravel bar there. Those are transport pieces. And then on the lower left is after the first winter. You can see that the pieces that were wedged are still there, and then the pieces that were placed on that gravel bar have floated up and kind of rotated into the pieces that were wedged to form a nice jam. And then on the lower right is the same project area after the second winter, and you can see that it's really starting to recruit a lot more small wood, which is really nice in-stream cover. This is some of the channel morphology survey work that we've done. So this is from Cass Creek on the Noyo River, a project that Campbell Timberland Management implemented there. And the blue line is the channel profile pre-project. And this slide is post-project, but before winter flows. So you can see all the red dots there are the pieces of large wood that were placed. And then this is the blue line is still the pre-project profile, and the green line is the post-winter project profile. This is surveyed 2 years after placement. And you can see that we've started to form a lot of pools around the areas where there were project pieces, significantly altering the channel form there. I'm not going to dwell a lot on the effectiveness monitoring, but just to say that in all the projects that we've done, we've seen a significant increase in the percentage of pool habitat by total length of stream channel. We've seen really big increases in most cases in the amount of both small and large wood that's being stored in the channel. Increases in the number of pools, and significant increases in the amount of shelter in those pools that's related to either large or small wood. In the middle there, the residual pool depth is kind of an interesting one that we're trying to get our arms around. It was variable, but on average we actually saw a slight decrease in residual pool depths, despite the fact that we had really significant increases in total pool area. And we think that might be because a number of these smaller streams have been incised, and by adding wood, we're actually causing aggradation in a lot of places, trapping gravels and reconnecting to floodplains. And so residual pool depths in some areas appear to be actually increasing rather than decreasing. But this is, like I said, preliminary data. So another thing I wanted to emphasize is that despite the fact that we're not anchoring the wood, we're seeing really high retention rates. So the oldest project we have is in the South Fork 10 miles, is one of Campbell's projects. It's about 6 years old, and they just resurveyed this last fall in 2012, and they found 82% of the pieces they'd placed within that treatment reach. And we see, similarly high retention rates across our projects. Another thing that's really been of interest to us is the cost of doing these projects. So these costs, I should say, do not include the cost of wood. In all of these cases, the landowner donated the wood to us. But you can see that the cost ranges from, just below $100 per log to up to $450 per log, and that the variability in cost depends on access, availability of wood, which technique we're using. If we're using just direct falling, like the Clark Fork 10-mile project, it could be quite cheap. If we're using a significant amount of equipment time and heavy equipment operator time, like the North Fork Garcia River, the project cost can be quite a bit higher. But compared to some of the more traditional hard anchored type projects, we're talking about somewhere on the order to a quarter to half the cost per log. So I wanted to address a few of the things that we have found lead to successful projects. The first is that you really need a skilled team, folks who have hydrology, geomorphology, fisheries experience. You need really skilled heavy equipment operators and timber fallers. That cannot be underestimated. And you need a really good understanding of your stream. What are the limiting factors for salmon in your stream? What are the existing conditions like? You also need money, you need wood, and you need permits. And I would recommend that you do at least some basic monitoring as well to learn from the projects that you implement. The things that we consider when we're doing these projects, which locations to target and which trees to use, there's a number of things we think about. Like I said, we have really strict canopy cover requirements in our permits, so that's one of the primary things we're thinking about, particularly for direct falling of trees. And that direct falling may sound easy, but it's actually, it's pretty hard, and there are very few trees that are really good candidates for this. You need to think really carefully about minimizing unintended breakage. Falling trees into a U-shaped stream channel is really challenging, particularly if it's redwood. There can often be a lot of breakage if you don't know what you're doing. We're thinking about minimizing canopy loss, both the primary loss from the tree that we're falling as well as any secondary loss that might happen as a result of that tree falling on alders or other trees. We are thinking about local channel conditions and morphology. And above all, thinking about safety. And I mentioned before that wood size is really important. So, ideally we want the largest trees we can get, but at a minimum we're looking at trees that are at least 1.5 times the bankful width. Where we're doing direct falling, layout is extremely important in tree selection. There may be the perfect tree, but the timber faller doesn't have a good layout, and we have to move past that tree. Equipment access is really important in places where we're going to use heavy equipment. We do not build new skid trails to get down to the creek, so we only bring equipment down where we have access already on existing trails. Another design consideration is how much wood to add, and I don't have an answer for you on this one. Wood loading and in-stream characteristics vary really widely over the landscape, and there's not really a clear scientific consensus on how much wood is sufficient to support salmon needs at this point. But we do have a good sense from existing studies that I'm showing here in this figure that current levels are well below those supported by older forests. This is for redwood forests here. On the left I have 2 data points, one from Worcester and Hilton and one from Keller and Talley, that show somewhere on the order of 8,000 to 17,000 cubic feet per acre of stream channel of in-stream wood. And the first project we did out on Inman Creek, we were starting with somewhere on the order of 1,400 cubic feet per acre. Permitting is a really important thing to be thinking about when entering into these projects. There are a number of ways to acquire the necessary permits. The first is what I'm calling choose your own adventure, where you do all of the permitting yourself. So there are quite a few permits that are required to do these projects. The first is an Army Corps of Engineers 404 permit. They consider wood to be fill and therefore regulate its addition to the stream environment. They do have a nationwide permit that streamlines the process for habitat restoration projects, so that helps out there. They will consult with both Fish and Wildlife Service and NOAA on ESA, Endangered Species Act issues. And NOAA has a streamlined, they have a biological opinion that allows them to consult under Section 7 of the ESA, which streamlines that part of the process. And that biological opinion covers the Central California Coast Coho region. And I understand that the SONC, Southern Oregon, Northern California Coho region also just recently signed a biological opinion that you may be able to take advantage of there as well. In addition to the 404, you also need a 401 permit from the Water Board. They also have a streamlined process for small habitat restoration projects. Depending on where you're located, if you're in California, you'll probably need to get either a 1600 stream bed alteration agreement, or you may be eligible. There's a new program that just started this year, the Department of Fish and Wildlife is implementing, called the Coho Help Program, which is a streamlined permitting program for small habitat restoration projects. It covers large wood projects, riparian planting projects, as well as fish barrier removal projects that have, all of those things have to have a disturbance impact of less than 5 acres, so small projects may qualify. If you qualify for Coho Help, that would also get you out of the of CEQA and CISA. If you don't qualify for Coho Help, you would also have to get CEQA and CISA determinations as well. There are some ways to, some existing mechanisms that streamline permitting. The Fisheries Restoration Grant Program that Department of Fish and Wildlife administers is a great example. They have programmatic permits with most of the agencies I've mentioned previously, and so if you apply and are granted money through that program, they handle most of the permitting for you. I realized after I put this slide together that I'm missing one other critical permitting mechanism, which is particularly important for small landowners, and that's the PIR programs, Partners in Restoration programs, that a number of RCDs administer in the state. Those could also be ways of acquiring permits to do these kinds of projects. And then the final thing is timber harvesting plans. So the new ASP rules offer a mechanism for potentially permitting these kinds of projects through a THP, and there's a pilot project that Campbell's working on right now with CAL FIRE to do just that, but it's really early phases. So there's a lot of funding opportunities, and I won't go through them all here, but I've listed a number of potential funders and funding opportunities that I'm aware of to fund these sorts of projects. In closing, our findings are that these kinds of projects increase pool habitat, they increase shelter and structure values in the stream for salmon. Wood volumes increase. Large wood is retained in the channel at really high rates. Residual pool depths appear to decrease, which may elevate stream beds over time. And the accelerated recruitment approach that we're using can be more economical than traditional anchored structures, you know, looking at somewhere like $1,000 per log for a more traditional anchored structure, compared to somewhere on the order of $250 per log for this accelerated recruitment approach. But I do want to emphasize that this is really only one tool in the restorationist toolbox. There are plenty of places that you would not want to think about doing this kind of method. So it's certainly not appropriate for every situation. Places where there are significant infrastructure concerns downstream, urban environments, for example, are probably not a great place to take this approach. You need to consider wood supply, watershed context, your stream type, your channel morphology, your channel width, Like I said at the beginning, we're working in relatively small watersheds with lower stream power. If you were working in the lower Klamath River or, the lower Eel, the stream power and the bank flow widths are going to far exceed the ability of this kind of project to work. So far, we're treating streams that are, 20 to 80 feet in bank flow width, and have found that, where the maximum bank flow width reaches up into that 70 to 80 range, that's about the maximum, above which we've had a really hard time getting trees into the creek that are of sufficient size to be retained. But we think there are a lot of places that this approach makes sense for rapidly accelerating the recruitment of wood over a large scale. So landowners that have really large land holdings and a lot of trees and little risk to infrastructure, for example, large timberland owners of the North Coast, are ideally suited for this kind of approach. And coincidentally, we know that these kinds of ownerships are key to recovering coho salmon. So an example from Mendocino County, the 7 largest landowners, they're all large-scale timberland owners, own over 10,000 acres. They manage about 73% of the NIMP's core coho areas. So we feel that this approach may provide a good tool to efficiently target restoration activities on a small number of ownerships for maximum effect on coho habitat. I just wanted to briefly touch on some other techniques for adding wood that might be appropriate in other situations. So the photograph I have here is of some really great work that Rocco Fiore has done up in some of the tribs of the lower Klamath. You can see from this photograph we're talking about a really wide channel here, that greatly exceeds the ability of an unanchored project to really work very well. Incredible stream power in the winter. So he started doing these projects that are called engineered log jams. These are projects that are well described in the literature. They've been implemented quite a bit in larger streams and rivers in Oregon and Washington, and Rocco's been doing some really cool ones in Northern California as well. You can see he's using primarily whole tree materials, and he is doing these projects where he has an excavator in the channel and is actually excavating out gravels and building kind of like a cribbing structure with vertical piles. You can see the pieces of wood that are driven vertically into the channel here to create a really large, robust structure that's likely to persist in this really highly mobile environment. And there's definitely a place for the traditional anchored structure as well. This is a diagram from the Department of Fish and Wildlife's Habitat Restoration Manual. If you're doing projects, say, in Santa Cruz County, as an example, or San Mateo County, where there's a significant number of residences right next to the stream, you've got lots of culverts and bridges downstream, this may be an appropriate approach in those situations. I'd like to thank the property owners and the funders, as well as our timber faller, Ken Smith, and Allison Chambers, who's done a lot of the monitoring work for these projects. And I have one more slide here which has a few links on it. The top link there is a document from the Wood for Salmon Working Group, which I've been working with, we created a permitting guidance document that sort of walks through the steps, the permitting steps to permit these kinds of projects. A link to the Fisheries Restoration Grant Program to check out funding opportunities as well as permit help, and then also a link to the Coho Help Act that I mentioned earlier. And if we have time, I'd be happy to take questions.
Thank you, Jen. There are a couple questions here from Joshua White.
Okay.
Josh's first question was, what was the range in stream gradients in your study streams, and were they all perennial streams?
Yes, they were all perennial streams, and the streams, we were targeting coho streams, so I think almost all of them were under 3% in gradient. And then the second question, oh sorry,
so
go ahead.
You also got a question here about wood DBH bearing as a function of thankful with is true. I think you were talking about length. With
Yeah.
length, yeah.
We found that length was actually the most important factor in retention. Bigger pieces, ideally we want pieces with bigger DBHs. The issue we were having is almost all the properties that we're doing these projects on are properties that have been harvested, at least twice. And so the trees that we have to work with in general are on the lower end of things, DBH-wise. But, because we're in the redwood region, we do have trees, even though they're young, that have pretty good height, and we were able to use them and have them be retained. I mean, ideally, we would love to be using trees, that are bigger than the ones we were able to use in these projects.
Yeah, just leave the links up here for a minute so that people, if they want to, they can jot them down. The other thing is that on the website, these presentations will be posted as PDFs, and eventually they'll be posted as recordings. I also wanted to mention, for those of you that are interested, continuing forestry education credits are being offered for the webinar series. So if you're interested in that, contact me. Thanks so much, Jen. And I think from here we'll move on to Cajun James.
Great, thank you.